But as far as the golden trout, this has been a labor of love with me as long as my professional responsibility. But my first recollection of seeing a golden trout was when our family was camped at Tuolumne Meadows in the upper part of Yosemite Park, just before you head over Tioga Pass into the Mono Basin. And my father wanted to show us Devil's Postpile. So we loaded in our fierce old Plymouth and into Devil's Postpile area. And it was raining like mad. And Carl, my brother, and I were just talking about this yesterday, how because of the heavy volcanic involvement over there, we watched the water running down the road, floating pumice along that way. So we got down to the San Joaquin River, that's the river there. It's a west side drainage, actually. And here came a fisherman. My dad said, "Let's see what he's caught." And it was a fisherman that had been fishing there in the Middle Fork, San Joaquin, and he had some golden trout. And I can still see that, even though this was probably nearly 70 years ago.
Now, what is the impact of seeing the golden trout?
Well, I'd say the impact was this, that it kind of imprinted on me, and because of that, I got this deep interest in golden trout.
But are they particularly beautiful?
Oh, yes, they are.
Distinctive?
They are, and somewhere and along the line, I'm going to have to send you the first painting made of a golden trout. It was in 1905, when Theodore Roosevelt prevailed upon the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries to send a scientist from the Bureau of Fisheries, a fellow named Dr. Barton Warren Everman, Evermann, to do a research study. The famous author Stewart Edward White, who's written Wild Geese Calling and so on, he had been on a pack trip up into the Upper Kern River. And it was quite easy, it's always been easy to catch golden trout up there. But he was afraid that because of increasing fishing pressure, they could become extinct. And it was not an unrealistic thought. It could be. And as I look on it now, it's been very difficult for people to fish all of the fish out of there. So Everman went in there at the instigation of President Theodore Roosevelt, motivated by Stewart Edward White, and ran this study for a couple of years.
On
golden trout.
Just
yeah.
Their life cycle.
His paper, this famous paper called The Golden Trout of the Southern High Sierras. And he, for whatever reason, pluralized Sierras like that, which is wrong, of course, but that's okay. We'll give him credit for that. His work was excellent. But that was before the days of digital single lens reflexes. And if you're going to record this, you brought in somebody who was a competent artist. I mean, black and white photography was not too advanced in 1905. So Everman did these absolutely gorgeous color drawings of these different fishes up there. And I'm dickering right now with a forester who's publishing this big paper of mine. I said, if you print my paper without a color photograph of a golden trout, it will border on blasphemy. And we'll see if they buy this or not. But I think they will. It's, of course, an absolutely beautiful fish.
So just tell me what it looks like.
Well,
or how is it different from the other trout?
Okay, well, it has an overall golden appearance to it. Its belly, particularly, is gold. Lack of a better term, it's like a newly minted gold piece with a bright red stripe along the side. And then what we call par marks in our lingo, which are they're kind of vertical marks along, maybe six or seven of them along what in ichthyological terms we call the lateral line. But for practical purposes, it's about halfway down the fish, and it's a sensory mechanism that trout have. And brilliant red fins.
Wow.
And it's kind of like, if you want to, probably the best way to describe it, it's kind of like an aquatic canary or an oriole, something like that. It comes close to an oriole.
How nice.
It's a beautiful fish. So
and it had a restricted range.
It evolved in the Upper Kern River Plateau, which is south of the main Sierra, really. Mount Whitney comes along, and then south of that, you go into the Kern Plateau. That Mount Langley. Mount Langley is the southernmost 14,000-foot peak. And then from then on, the plateau gradually grades down until it hits the area around Lake Isabella and Kernville, quite a ways south. Well, okay, part of my job then in Fish and Game was to be concerned over the biological integrity of these waters that were under my jurisdiction then. My first hint of something going wrong up there was during the mid-'60s, when there's a very good angler in Kernville, kind of a town father, I guess you want to call it. His name was Ardis Walker, A-R-D-I-S Walker. And we got to be friends. And, they have a Kern River Association group that meets in Kernville, and I went down there, gave talks a couple of times, and he sent me a message one time, and he says, you know, every time I go fishing in the Kern, seems like I find brown trout farther north. Of course, the Kern River essentially flows from the north to the south, and then cuts to the west, and it goes into the Central Valley.
And the trout were up.
Trout were up in the upper reaches.
Further north.
Yeah, they evolved in the upper reaches, in probably from 9,000 to 11,000 feet in elevation, somewhere in that range.
And when do they think they evolved? How long ago?
Since the end of the Ice Age, I would say at least in the last 8,000 to 10,000 years.
Okay.
And they evolved through geographic isolation. It's very similar to the pupfish we've talked about.
From the rainbow trout?
From the rainbow trout. Probably their grandfathers way back were the steelhead rainbow that came up unrestricted before all the water went out into agriculture, cotton fields, whatever, in the southern Central Valley. But the Kern River rainbow is probably their progenitor fish, which, maybe 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, were isolated by a couple of things, but mainly volcanic flows, creating what we now call volcano falls between the lower part of Golden Trout Creek now and the main Kern River. These falls are substantial falls. They drop hundreds of feet, kind of like Yosemite Falls in a way. So Ardis said, every time I go up there, I find brown trout. And I was concerned about this because brown trout shouldn't have ever been imported from Europe, for that matter, in terms of biodiversity reasons, but they were, and they are a very hardy fish, very successful fish, and also a lot of fun for people to catch. So it wasn't too long after that. This would have been maybe the mid-'60s. I received a phone call, I think this is 1969, perhaps. A lot happened in '69. Everything.
Yeah, big year.
Yeah. 1969, I just turned 40 in 1969, right? Gee, so much has happened since then. But in any event, our game warden, a fellow named Vern Brandt, living in Lone Pine, that was part of his patrol district up there, where our wardens, which are separate from the biologists, are the enforcement component of the Department of Fish and Game.
And you didn't have any jurisdiction over them?
No.
Parallel?
Well, we did work closely together. This is a good example. He phoned me up. He said, Phil, you ought to know this, because a good friend of mine, my next door neighbor here in Lone Pine, caught a brown trout way up in the South Fork Kern River. And he says he knows it's not a mistake, because he knows his fish really well. He knows a brown trout when he catches it. I thought, oh boy. Even while I was talking to him, is one of these things that you can envision what this is going to entail. Now remember, that was nearly 40 years ago now. I could see what would happen. We're going to have to go up there. We're going to have to build barriers to keep brown trout from moving up into that area. We're going to have to take those that were already there, kill them off somehow, and restock with golden trout. And that's exactly what it was. I went up there the next...
But how do you kill one species and not the other?
You can't. That's part of the story here. Oh. If you kill a brown trout, you're going to kill everything else that's in the stream, way of fish. So we went up there the next day. Luckily, it's a flying service. the tunnel airstrip goes right along to South Fork Kern where this fellow caught his brown trout. So, and there's a pilot there at that time named Bob White, and Bob flew us in there in a Cessna 180, which is a great airplane for that. And we took a fish shocker in, which is a great, quick way to catch fish. It takes a 6-volt battery or 12-volt battery, it jumps it up to a really high voltage, and it knocks fish out. It doesn't kill them, but just and that's
Over a big area?
Well, it depends on the composition of the water. Mm-hmm. The more salt in the water, the more it acts. Mm-hmm. The higher the mineral content of the water. So we went up and just below the airstrip, just had hardly started, and we got a 5-pound brown trout in a stream that about the distance from me to you right now, maybe 7 or 8 feet wide. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh boy. And this was up above what we thought were barriers, but they weren't barriers.
Mm-hmm. Were they intentional barriers?
No,
Or they were
it's a natural
barriers.
Yeah, it's a natural, what we call tunnel guard station, Forest Service station there. Mm-hmm. And between, well, but just below this, the South Fork Kern drops significantly.
I see, and that's, you thought would keep the brown
Yeah,
trout.
yeah, we thought this would keep them from coming up. So this, what do we do now? Well, we thought, well, first off, looking at the stream in different components, there's the upper part above the guard station. Then you have a middle part, then a lower part. So right away I began to think we have to start at the upper end for obvious reasons. Because if you kill off the fish halfway down, then a bunch of impure ones come down, impure, hybridized fish come downstream because they're going to negate your work. So at this time we brought in engineers. We had enough humility by that time on building things as biologists on our spawning channel work. So we better bring in engineers. Well, both the Forest Service, the Annual Forest, and Cal Fish and Game had very good civil engineers then. Still do. And so flew in an engineer, a couple of them, and they went down and said, we got to barrier this stream somehow. So we found a place in that gorge just below, and we'll have to have a map here too to put on in the manuscript somewhere along the line, or the tapes. We got to somehow barrier this gorge. There's probably maybe 15 miles of stream above this, and brown trout had gone clear to the top. And there's no way that you could take that fish shocker because this won't get all the fish. There will always be a couple somewhere that you missed. You try your best with it. You can go up and down that darn stream. You keep getting brown trout. So we found a spot about halfway down the gorge, Templeton, or the Ramshaw Gorge, we call it. Because the meadow just below the tunnel is Ramshaw Meadow. So this is known as the Ramshaw Gorge. Maybe a couple of miles between the lower part of Tunnel Meadow and the upper part of Ramshaw Meadow. And they found a spot there that we could make a barrier. We didn't have to pour concrete or anything. It was a natural constriction in the stream that we could blast rock with and fill up the stream bed up to a point that would ultimately silt in and create an impassable drop of maybe 10 feet. And if you have a drop of 10 feet, trout aren't going to jump over it. So we did. We went in and we blasted the heck out of rock. It's all in close cooperation with the Inyo National Forest and their biologists and their engineers and powder experts and the whole thing.
How about hydrologists?
Well, that too. We had a hydrologist working with us, a Forest Service guy, Tom Philando, just really a great guy. And he knew his work really well too. Tom had it's a sidelight here, he had a great ability to use malapropisms. I remember one time we were up there on the same project. We were camped out. And I've always had a hard time getting up in the morning. I hate to get out of bed, but Tom's one of these people at the crack of dawn would be out jumping around building fires and things, happily putting on the coffee. And so he did this one morning. I yelled out, it was a really cold morning. It makes it even harder to get up, you know. I said, Tom, why don't you just shut up and go back to bed? And his response was something just would die. He says, "Come on, Phil. This is the best time of the day when we all get up and conjugate around the fire."
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So, okay, back to town. But we went all over that entire area, checking out springs and marshes and things. So we built that first barrier. Then we had to then remove the bad fish from up above it, which were both golden trout and brown trout. Happily, no hybridized rainbow trout, because golden trout and rainbow trout are very close genetically. They can hybridize.
But brown and
No, they're different. Two things. They're different genera, for one thing. Brown trout is Salmo, the golden trout is Oncorhynchus.
oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and this is a rainbow.
So they're much too distinct.
Yeah,
to
yeah.
hybrid.
And
But do the brown trout drive out the golden trout?
Yes.
Why were you concerned
Yes.
if they wouldn't
Yes, they
hybridize?
do. They will do this. They just by their numbers and their highly, I say, aggressive behavior and predation. They will.
They kill the young, or they eat all the
They'll
food?
eat anything
or-
they can get their mouths around, and ultimately that'll render the species extinct or eradicated, extirpated is a better term we use. Fish are all gone, but there's still others somewhere else. If there's nothing anywhere else, they're extinct. But
Yeah,
extirpated from a given area, extinct from the planet Earth.
I see. Okay, so if you let this go, eventually the
Oh
golden
yeah,
trout
yeah.
would have been...
In fact, when we started running our detailed analyses on these things, going in with the fish shocker again and collecting large numbers, there's no differentiation between the susceptibility to a current between brown trout and golden trout. So you're getting them in equal numbers.
So you
We
could
found out that in many locations that the brown trout outnumbered the golden trout nearly 100 to 1.
Oh, my.
And the golden trout were nearly gone.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm surprised you hadn't had more reports.
Well, yeah, I am too, really. But I think it was very fortunate that this one fellow mentioned to his next door neighbor, who was one of our game wardens, who was keenly aware of the sensitivity of the whole thing, to phone me up so we could start doing something about it. So that was in September of 1969 that we went up there and found this great big brown trout. And they were all over the place. That was the largest we got. I use this in illustration in my paper. This guy holding this great big darn fish, nearly as wide as the stream was. You know. So that we built the barrier. We then had to remove the brown trout from up above the barrier. But to do that, we had to remove everything. Happily, there are two streams here, the South Fork Kern River and Golden Trout Creek, come within probably 200 yards of one another, yet they're totally separate drainages. So we could collect golden trout from above the barrier that were pure fish and hold them in cages over in Golden Trout Creek that was not going to be subjected to the chemicals.
I see. And was Golden Trout Creek, had any
No.
infestation?
No brown trout over there at all. But we were afraid because they were so close. We have in fish management, and particularly in wilderness areas, we call the coffee pot or bucket syndrome, where somebody says, "God, those fish were good. I didn't see many over here. Let's take some from here and put them over there." You know. And it's almost always devastating when they do that, ultimately. So we did. We collected up, I think, 6,000 golden trout from that upper area. With the fish
nets?
shockers.
Oh, with the fish shockers.
You go through the
oh,
shockers.
that's right, because it doesn't
that
kill
pulls
them.
them out front of the banks where you can get them with a net. Then from there they go into a bucket, and then from there into these hardware claw holding boxes that we would put them in.
Who did the labor on this?
Well, you tell that if you were ever to look at the acknowledgement section in my paper. I would say there are probably close to 50 people from all different parts of life, and
Were volunteers?
a lot of volunteers. We had one fellow who was a forestry student back at Syracuse University in New York that flew out at his own expense from New York to LA and then came on up to help us with this project. We had a number of people. We had people from the Department of Transportation, UC Davis, a guy from Berkeley, all there because they were very interested in this and they saw the conservation implications of it.
Did people from California Trout and
Yeah, they helped too.
groups like that?
Although the most of the help from them came a little later on when we turned that whole area into the golden trout wilderness.
Okay, but I'll let you go on with your story
Oh,
instead
okay.
of bothering.
Okay. Well, so
Interrupting
then
you
we
here.
built that barrier, cleaned up that upper section, brought fish in from where we were holding them across the 200-yard section, restocked. Then,
Did you have to poison the? Have we said that?
well, we did, yeah, we put, there's two chemicals we use. They're kind of the old standby rotenone. It's a derivative of a South American plant, Daris root plant. And we learned this, somebody did, from the South American Indians. When they wanted to collect fish, they'd take this root, they'd smash it in the stream, and the fish would belly up. What it does, it renders the gills unable to assimilate oxygen. Of course, the gills are their counterpart to our lungs.
So and then what was the other?
The other is the thing called animicin, which is it's a good fish killer. It works very differently. This impacts the electron exchange between cells. It's a much more complicated.
So you end up with a lot of floating fish that
You
you
do.
have to get rid of.
Yeah, you do. And we would go through and get all we could and just bury them or put them out in the middle of a meadow where the coyotes would eat them the next night or something like that.
Did you get any flack for killing fish?
Yes. Luckily, most of this we did before the animal rights movement finally came in strong. I had to put up with a couple of really vitriolic letters from people say, why are golden trout more important than brown trout? They're both living organisms. And it comes down to ideologies again. They don't want to see anything killed. So I have a good friend who's an environmental philosopher at Colorado State, Holmes Ralston, who had written a book called Environmental Ethics, a textbook, printed by Temple University Press, Rolston. And he had used this very subject of our work on the kern and brown trout versus golden trout. Said, is it ethical to kill, say, the brown trout? And it was his analysis as a professional philosopher. Yeah, if it's a matter of the survival of a species, as opposed to the well-being of an individual trout that should not be there in the first place, from the standpoint of natural biodiversity, then it is indeed ethical to kill these fish. Well, I never heard back from these folks. The next problem we had with that were from the aquatic entomologists, who, see, these same chemicals will kill aquatic bugs as well.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
And part of our project, though, the first time we introduced this, I had an aquatic entomologist who worked for us from Oregon State, a graduate student, run a very good study on the impact of these things on the bugs, the mayflies, the stoneflies, the caddisflies, the whole thing.
That the fish eat.
Yeah. So before we restocked, happily, virtually all of these life forms, all the bugs, are wing forms, and they could fly over that 200-yard gap between the two streams and recolonize. And it was our impression too that we did not destroy the whole insect fauna, but just a fair amount of it. There were still layered active seeds So we waited several weeks before we restocked that, just to let the food base build up again. And that apparently worked out pretty well. But then we had to take this whole project then and continue to move it downstream. We wanted to rid the entirety of the golden trout wilderness of brown trout, which should not be there. And
But it wasn't a wilderness yet, was it? Was it already a wilderness?
No, but we knew this was coming.
Oh, okay.
And we were already working with the Forest Service on setting this up. This, I think, was around 1979, about nearly 10 years later,
Yeah.
when the Endangered American Wilderness Act was passed. I guess that was during the end of the Carter administration that happened. So
you moved on down with
yeah,
more.
we built another barrier. And then a third one, clear down at the boundary of the golden trout wilderness, which we knew would be about there. A place called Schaefer Meadow Barrier, another one, Templeton Barrier. Heavy volcanic activity up there, and there are these big cinder cones. Great big things. They'd be a couple thousand feet high. They're big pieces of nature there. And so we built another barrier that did not last too terribly long. That's interesting country. It's all decomposed granite and decomposing granite. Well, our first barriers were made of what we call gabions. A gabion is probably best described as a big box, maybe 6 feet long, maybe 2 feet high, 2 feet wide. The box being made out of essentially cyclone fence material, galvanized steel. And you just lay these in like big bricks in the stream. And they silt in. It makes a pretty good barrier. And the 2 barriers we built this way, down from the one where we filled in the stream, which is not subject to that, they lasted quite well for 7 or 8 years. But because of the decomposed granite going downstream, which is abrasive as all get out, it began to remove the galvanizing from the steel baskets. They then rusted, and by the weight of the rocks in there, began to disintegrate. When they did this, the support for the main structure would begin, particularly most of that force was hitting on what we call the aprons, the lower downstream part of that barrier. That it began to crumble and go away, and when that happened, the whole barrier began to tip. So we try to hold the line until we do something even better. We flew in 2 by 2 by 2 foot cubes of concrete, precast concrete, and paved the area right below the dam with these blocks of concrete, just to keep this hydraulic force from further degrading the gabion baskets. Well, that worked for a while, but we could tell something better had to be done than that. So in 1996, 96, Department of Fish and Game, within the department, they have we call our screen shop crews. And they're just generally good at all types of construction. We brought them in on horses, and luckily the forest supervisor, even though this was in the wilderness in 1996, he allowed us to bring in motorized equipment. He said, if we're going to, I think he recognized the total incompatibility of having a golden trout wilderness with no golden trout.
Right.
And we were closely getting to it. And so he said, we'll just look the other way. If somebody doesn't like it, we'll explain why we did what we did. And they can sue us if they want. So Dennis Martin was a real help to us in this respect. So they flew in codfree mixers. We flew in something like 80 cubic yards of pre-mixed concrete with helicopters. Things to saw the reinforcing bar with, the rebar. You need carborundum saws to cut this to the right lengths and things. And all that was brought in and set it. We had then to put the South Fork Current River into a big pipe so we could build a barrier around it. And this was all done by one of our engineers named George Heisey there in Sacramento. And these guys just did a marvelous job. So we got the Templeton barrier done. The same thing, the degradation was happening at the very lowest barrier, at Schaefer Meadows. So we had to build a similar barrier there. And it just totally amazes me yet, and how in about, when was this? Early part of the 2000s, 2002, I believe, or 3. And Fish and Game has never been high on anybody's funding list. We're all way down at the bottom. Somehow my counterparts in Fresno were able to get $2.5 billion to build the lower barrier. And that's a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
A bunch of tight-fisted congressmen or state legislators to build a fish barrier. And you'd have people in Fish and Game would question using that much money for this, but they did. They got it, contracted it out. It was done by the Department of Water Resources. They were the contracting agency. We just paid them for it. But they had private contractors come in and build the thing. I think in 2002 they had a huge forest fire. They got everything going, and the Forest Service made everybody move out because they were afraid everybody was going to get incinerated by this fire, and they had good reason for that. So we had to stop the project in 2002 and complete it in 2003. But the barrier itself is a real piece of work. It's a beautiful thing.
How does it look? Does it look like a big intrusion into
No,
the natural scene?
well, of course, anything like that's going to be an intrusion. But the Forest Service, their people are good. it's all faced with a simulated rock. And it's not like doesn't look like Hoover Dam or a big concrete thing. This is very thoughtfully done. And I'll have to send you some pictures of that. Cause
There are a lot of writings about, is nature natural and how much have we constructed nature? And here's a great example
it's a good
of
example of that.
completely constructed attempt to kind of preserve a natural ecosystem, but it's totally based on this huge engineering feat.
There's a guy in one of the early issues of the journal Environmental Ethics who wrote a paper, a graduate student, on the ethics of artifacts, which these things are. And he said you can justify it on this basis. So to go back a bit again now fortunately, our work worked. It worked out. We were able to kill all the brown trout, but this took a lot of work. We had to chemically treat with rotenone over 100 miles of stream, which is a huge amount to have to do, and to make sure you got all of the brown trout out at the time.
And really make sure you have everything out.
Yeah. So another interesting part of this, the only other native fish up there in that upper area was the Sacramento sucker. Well, most fishermen disdain things like suckers, although that's part of the bowl shaping the water
Right.
from the evolutionary standpoint. So we, as part of our restocking, we restocked Sacramento suckers in there right along with the golden trout.
And do they compete with the golden trout?
Not really, because they co-evolved. There might be some that would be a minimal thing. We find two species have co-evolved. They've learned to live with each other. So
But did you have to explain that to the California trout groups or any of
did.
those?
Particularly there's a group of fly fishermen in Ridgecrest, which is out in the desert across from Porterville. It's home of the Naval Weapons Center, Ridgecrest and China Lake. And they were somewhat upset by all of this in the first place. They could understand what we're doing with the golden trout. They had a tough time with the suckers. Until I used that same exact analogy of the water shaping the
They got it.
Yeah. So they did. These people are a sharp bunch. They pick up this stuff and they find out they're going to be able to go up fishing anyway. That's the big thing. So, but back again to the bugs and the quartz. We've had a terrible time. Well, luckily we were able to do this with the golden trout. But with other species, my counterparts in Region 2, which are out of Sacramento, Region 6 we have now is out of Bishop, pretty much. But the people working on Silver King Creek, which is a tributary to the East Fork Carson, comes and joins with the West Fork, and they go down and they end up in the Carson Sink, in the Carson Valley, near Carson City. They're native habitat. They evolved there, these Lahontan cutthroat trout, or the Paiute cutthroat trout.
So they're a separate species.
Totally, yeah. They're different, same genus, but a different species, and certainly different subspecies. So for the last couple of years, they've had the same essential thing of an invasion of rainbow trout and an infusion of rainbow trout genes into that Paiute trout population. So they've been all ready to go twice. And our opponents on this, who
Ready to go.
to do the treatment there to get rid of the
poisoning.
hybridized fish, or impure, whatever you want to call them,
Yeah.
hybridized fish. They've been all set to go. Their equipment all up, people from all over the state go to help, and at the last minute, a judge will grant a restraining order to stop it.
And who's bringing the
It's
suit?
this group of people who don't want this chemical introduced into the stream. In a way, they've got a good point. We don't yet fully understand the impact of these chemicals, so I can understand that. I've always looked at it this way. There's a possibility that we could lose, say, a subspecies of a mayfly, although it's unlikely as all get out. But if we don't do that, we certainly are going to lose the fish. But then they'll say, why is a fish more important than a bug? Well, I don't think it is. But we know we're going to lose one. We don't think we're going to lose the other.
Yeah.
We brought in the best aquatic entomologists anywhere to help us with these studies. It's not like we're brushing them off, or because we took a course in Ent 1A as undergraduates and think we know it all. We don't at all. We understand that. So the major appendix item in the paper I'm writing on golden trout relates to that very subject of this grad student at Oregon State who came down to just to assess the impact of these chemicals on the aquatic invertebrates.
But the challenge is based on other species and not on animal rights.
Far less so. The animal rights people, they've sounded off now and then, but with no real... See, one thing has helped here. There's been some good research done, particularly by a researcher up at the University of Wyoming, up in Laramie. Do trout feel pain? And doing all of the most sophisticated studies he can do, he said, no, they don't. At least not as we experience it. And so with that, it takes away most of the argument that the animal rights people might have, particularly where you're dealing with, say, an imported fish from Europe, or even in the east slope drainage, rainbow trout from the other side of the mountain, from over here as opposed to the other side of the crest of the Sierra. It takes away much of the argument they might otherwise use. Again, it's a matter of ideology, and oftentimes you can't argue with those folks. They're so convinced in what they're doing.
Yeah, they have their sense of right and wrong.
Well, they do, and certainly under the First Amendment, they're entitled to state them.
Were you telling me that some of the golden trout had also been transplanted to
Yes.
areas they didn't
Yes, they have.
originate in?
Beginning around the turn of the century, that would be 1800s into the 1900s, the beginning of the 20th century, fish began to be moved. Brown trout were brought here from Europe. But then they began to be moved by design. I don't think the Indians did much of this. But white people came in and started moving fish. And kind of curiously and almost paradoxically, one of the major movers of fish were the Sierra Club. They would go in on their famous high trips back in that era with large numbers of pack stock, mules, horses, whatever. And they would get all of the gear hauled in, the food, the tents, and the sleeping bags, all this other stuff. Here they'd have maybe 20 or 30 horses or mules sitting around with nothing to do. Well, back in that time, in fact, he was the one who took over the Sierra Club after John Muir bowed out, Will Colby Meadow along the Muir Trail on the Southern Sierra. He loved to fish. And so he would then supervise these groups that would go on the current, catch fish, isolate them, seine them out, whatever, in these same streams, Golden Trout Creek and South Fork Current, put them into cans slung on the side of horses and mules and start moving them northward, gradually moving them way up. I've got a photograph that I use in lectures also, showing the old Fish and Game Commission 20-mule team in 1914 hauling golden trout up over Paiute Pass out of Bishop to plant in the upper parts of the San Joaquin River drainage.
Were they considered better eating, or is it,
Well,
again, the
no, but they were
attractiveness of them?
probably available more than anything.
I see.
Because see, our first hatchery over there wasn't built till I think 1916, the Mount Whitney Fish Hatchery, so there was no other place to get
They
them.
were available because they were the
Yeah,
native.
Sure, and there are
fish.
lots of them. They could just get wild fish. And the hatcheries, when they came along, began to plant little guys.
Because there simply weren't fish in the other.
No, I should point this out, that the lakes that these fish were transplanted or planted into, introduced into, have all been created by glacial action since the end of during the Pleistocene. They dug out these holes, then the lakes gradually, of course, had water in them. They didn't have ice in them anymore, and started to build up food chains in the different lakes. And so here are all these waters. And the thinking back at that time was, if something's wet, it's got to have fish planted in it. Nobody thought about biodiversity in 1900.
No.
bad enough in 2000.
So you're talking about the early days of the Sierra Club high trips.
Exactly. And it wasn't only the Sierra Club. There's a group in Bishop called the Rainbow Club of Bishop. And they loved to have, after the hatcheries got going, they would arrange with the Fish and Game Commission to do their own planning. And we've still got the records. I saved them. They're in the Bishop office of the requests and where the fish were planted. Well, the irony of this whole thing was much of the fingerling trout availability there was through our Mount Shasta fish hatchery up in McLeod, up in northern part of the Sacramento Valley. And most of what things they raised were steelhead. So one of the first guys I worked with, he says, an interesting story there. They would load these fish on what they call fish cars, railroad cars, and just start moving them, say, down the east side of the Central Valley with aeration equipment to keep the fish alive and pull into a side, and you get ice to keep the fish cold and things. And say there's a sportsman's group at Fresno, or on the other side in Bishop or Lone Pine. They say we want 5,000 golden trout, 3,000 eastern brook trout, 4,000 brown trout. So here would be this fish car would come up with nothing but steelhead on it. So they would take a can of seal, write brown trout on it. And so that's the way much of the kind of confusion of species distribution was exacerbated by that sort of thing.
So steelhead are related to rainbow, but they're not rainbow. Or
Steelhead, well, actually, it's a behavioral thing more than anything, or a
fresh water.
Pardon?
When they're in fresh water?
Well, yeah, what happens is the steelhead are anadromous fish. They go out in the ocean, they grow up, and they come back into fresh water and spawn. And that was part of my early work up in the North Coast, so I studied that. And then some of the steelhead then didn't return to the ocean and became resident rainbow trout.
I see.
But all on the west side until human beings began to move them by whatever means into areas where they were not native. And that would include the Owens Valley and on the others, in the Great Basin on the other side.
It's quite a natural history.
Oh, it really is. It really is.
Not so natural.
Not so natural. Probably the best book on this is Peter Moyle's Inland Fishes of California. Peter did a real fine job on that. He tells about those early situations. But the golden trout, back to that again, we're not out of the woods there at all. So we've had to, once we got the brown trout out, a matter of constant monitoring. You go up there in certain locations every year. You check the integrity of the barriers. Are they okay? Then get on up in the northern part of that Kern Plateau. We begin to see that even though we did our best, still rainbow trout were infused in the populations, probably not in great numbers, but in both the Golden Trout Creek and the South Fork Kern, the ones that come close to each other. So now this is where the geneticists come in, and particularly Molly Stevens, who's doing her doctoral work, who did her doctoral work on this, to give us some insight on the degree of hybridization. Can we maybe overcome, as we call genetic swamping, by bringing in pure fish and dumping them in there and so on. Sometimes that will work, but at least we have some very scientifically valid guidance stuff from good geneticists there at Davis to help us understand this. I'm very grateful for these people. Stephen Jay Gould, the recently departed philosopher, scientist at Harvard, put this so well. He said, we are trapped in the ignorance of our own generation. And that's as true today as it was 100 years from now. All we can do is hope to build on the mistakes we've made in past years and not repeat them in the future.